Hi, everybody. This is Maciel. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Labor and Employment webinar, What Employers Need to Know About COVID-19 Vaccination. This is the second webinar in the 2021 OSHA and Labor and Employment webinar series, and the first one we're doing jointly together. I am pleased to be joined by my colleagues, Fern Fleischer-Daves and Lindsay DiSalvo. I'll introduce a little bit myself, and then I'll let them introduce themselves before I cover the agenda, and we can kick it right off going forward. So I am Carey Maciel. I am the founding partner of Conn, Maciel, Carey. I chair the labor and employment practice of the firm. So my job is really to advise employers in all aspects of the employment relationship, A to Z, from hiring to firing and all the things that happen in between. I'm also a litigator, so I defend my clients in litigation, both in federal and state court, arising under the myriad of employment-related statutes. And I do a lot of counseling, again, on the various issues that arise in the employment relationship. Since March 2020, I have led the firm's COVID-19 task force with several of my other colleagues, advising employers on the issues arising from COVID-19 in the workplace. And this is just one of those topics. As we move forward now, getting into vaccines, this is going to be another issue that employers are confronting, and part of the task force and our integrated group of colleagues from our workplace and safety practice group. With that, I'll turn it over to Fern to introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm of counsel to the firm, and I'm working primarily with the workplace safety practice group. I have a long history on environmental safety and health and product stewardship matters. I specialize in compliance with federal regulations, and COVID crosses almost all of the federal programs, which is quite interesting. Previously, I was affiliated with Chevron, the Thermostat Recycling Corp, ITT, and ASARCO. So I have experience in many industries and bring a cross-functional perspective to this effort.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindsay DiSalvo, and I am an associate at Conn, Maciel, Carey in both the firm's OSHA and labor and employment practices. I represent employers and counsel employers on all different types of issues in both practices. And as Fern rightly said, COVID-19 is something that we've seen come up in numerous forms in both practice areas. So I've had a lot of experience over the past almost year now, since March 2020, counseling employers on the issues that have arisen in both the employment and OSHA contexts. And this vaccination issue is, I think, one of the newest issues we've seen. And hopefully today we can go over some of these particular concerns that we're seeing already come up in this context, and give our perspective on those.
Great. So here's our agenda today. Fern's going to kick it off talking about the COVID-19 background, vaccination background, and what you should be thinking about if you are considering rolling out a vaccination program at work, whether it's simply to educate versus encourage the vaccines, or are you going to incentivize your employees to take them or potentially mandate them. Then I'm going to cover the practical implications of a vaccine program, talking about the important issues of privacy and confidentiality. What happens if you've got someone who has a medical disability or needs a religious accommodation, how to navigate those, questions about what to do if people are refusing to vaccinate. And then Lindsay's going to close with what to do after the vaccine and some workplace safety things to continue beyond workers being vaccinated. So with that, I will kick it off to Fern.
Thank you, Carey. This is a chart from the CDC with data as of a few days ago. It's actually astonishing to me that 32 million people have received at least the first dose of the vaccine, and almost 10 million people have received both doses of the vaccine. That's amazing in less than 2 months. But it's just the beginning, and it's going to get very interesting. You can look at this CDC site every day and see where things are in your state. Just some key facts about the COVID vaccination. It will definitely prevent a person from getting very sick. Very few people have gotten severely ill after they've received the vaccine, although some people have gotten sick, they've not been hospitalized or died. Really important. Some people think this vaccine cannot give you COVID. These two vaccines approved in the United States do not have live vaccine, and you will not get COVID-19 if you are vaccinated with these two vaccinations. And you will not test positive on a viral test, but you may test positive on other types of tests. And we'll talk about that in a little while. There are only two vaccinations approved in the United States right now. These are emergency use authorizations. They were both granted in December of 2020. They both use a unique technology called mRNA, which has not been used in this type of vaccination in the past. It seems to be highly effective, more effective than other types of vaccines. There have been a few reports of individuals developing symptoms after vaccinations. There have been reports of allergic reactions, but given the large number of people who've already received the vaccination, these are quite small. Clinical trials are ongoing. They're currently testing vaccines in younger and younger people, both teenagers and younger children. And those results will come out probably in the next 3 or 4 months. There are many other vaccines that are currently being evaluated by the FDA. We think there'll be 1 or 2 approvals in the next month or so. Next slide, please. So who's eligible? This is a great question. It depends on where you are, your age, your health, and your job. Every state has different criteria. Every state has changed their criteria, and they could change it again. Some states started with, or all states started with people over 75 and healthcare workers. Many states have included some essential workers, but the definition of essential worker is different state to state. Also, even if a person is considered an essential worker in a certain state, they may not be eligible in one county or another, depending on supply. This is very confusing and very difficult to navigate. We're hopeful that it will get better as more supply is distributed throughout the country. Today and tomorrow, in many states, pharmacies will be receiving vaccines directly from the federal government, not from the state health departments, and that's going to broadly open up the availability. The federal government is also launching mega sites in many big cities, which are drive-through sites, and those will allow thousands of people to get the vaccine very quickly. In some states, there are last-minute signups. You need a computer and a lot of savvy to figure this out, but it's a little bit dicey. There are a few places where they have leftover vaccine at the end of the day. It will spoil if they don't use it, but the rules about how those extra vaccines are distributed are not clear, and there have been some problems in some locations. In many states, people with certain health conditions are eligible now, but those health conditions may be different state to state. In half the states, school teachers and college professors are eligible. In a few states, farm workers and grocery store clerks are eligible, taxi drivers, and about 20% of the states are now vaccinating lawyers and legal staff at the courthouses as eligible because they are essential workers. Again, all of this varies county to county, and sometimes the availability is spotty week to week. So let's hear some good news. There are quite a number of new tests that have been approved and sample collection methodologies. There are hundreds of devices that have been approved by the FDA in the last 4 or 5 months. There are 8 treatments that have been approved by the FDA for people who've been hospitalized, and the 2 vaccines which I mentioned, as well as new vaccines that will be approved soon. There's tons of new safety data, which is very exciting. And then there's some really cool stuff happening that hasn't been talked about much, but we'll hear more about it in the coming months. There are at least 5 organizations that are working on vaccination passports that would validate that you've received a vaccination, and it would link to a site for your airline or for the Department of State and link to your passport so that you could easily get through or get on and off an airplane in a foreign country. There are several countries that are training dogs to screen people at airports to smell you to see if you may be infected with COVID. This appears to be more effective than screening for temperature, and that's going to probably expand to crowded venues like sports arenas and concert halls. And there are many new technologies, and this is actually a very exciting time to be a researcher because there's so many things that are going to be good coming out of this. So what do we take from all of this? Vaccines are great, but they will not prevent all infections. Vaccines will certainly reduce serious symptoms and deaths. We're starting to see some data that supports that. Unfortunately, we do not have a lot of data that supports whether or not the vaccines will prevent transmission. So while you protect yourself, you may not protect others, which is why it's terribly important to stress that we don't change our practices for cleaning, disinfection, social distancing, and hand hygiene, and wearing layered face coverings, both at work and in public. This is very, very important. All that said, employers have a big role to play in the rollout of the vaccination programs, and we're going to talk about that more. So some of you want to roll out a vaccine program for your workers. There are a lot of different ways to tackle this. Everyone can take the first approach. Encourage your employees, provide education, recommend, facilitate, create a sign-up program, work with your local county health department or a local pharmacy, just to make it easy for your workers. Everyone can do that. Then there are many companies that are incentivizing their employees to do this. This is a direct benefit if you get vaccinated. That could be paid time off or some financial benefit. There are a few employers, really big employers, that are preparing to have on-site vaccination programs. I've heard of a number of companies that have received approval from their county and state health departments to be a vaccination site. They've purchased freezers, they've purchased supplies, and they're ready to go, but they don't have the supply yet. That will be coming. And then there's a possibility of a mandate. As a condition of employment, very few employers have announced a mandate. A lot of employers are considering it, and we're going to talk about some of the challenges to employer mandates. So if you want to encourage your employees, how do you get that information? There's a lot of good information from trustworthy government and medical sources, the CDC, the FDA, OSHA. There's lots of good stuff, and we will provide some links to really good materials. Also, your local hospital has good information that will be trustworthy and reliable. You can use multiple channels. You can have communications from your CEO and your other leaders. You can also work with your health plan administration and local medical institutions. There are a lot of resources out there. Just decide who you're going to work with and then go. There are a number of employers that are partnering with religious and advocacy organizations because their employees are hesitant and they want to have local trusted leaders talk to their employees and encourage them to get the vaccination on time. So this is a great toolkit on the CDC's website. They have posters that you can plug in your company's logo with people with masks, people with hard hats in different professions. It's actually really nice looking stuff. They have frequently asked questions. They've got newsletter content that you could plug into your company newsletter. They have social media content, and I encourage you all to take a look at this because someone's already done a lot of work that you can take advantage of. So what's the difference between encouraging and incentivizing? Well, on the first day of the Biden administration, the president issued an executive order saying employers should make COVID-19 vaccines available at no cost, but there was no reference to incentives. We think that will be coming soon. The EEOC issued guidance in December, and they said specifically, you may offer incentives so long as you allow for medical and religious exemptions. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. If you do offer a religious or medical exemption, you have to have an accommodation process, and you must be in compliance with a number of federal and state laws that protect people's privacy as well as their rights under these various regulations. Strangely, there was a proposed rulemaking that really doesn't fit into this, which is that the EEOC, under the previous administration, they talked about restrictions and wellness programs that any incentive should be of de minimis value. This has been heavily criticized by a number of business organizations, including even last week by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and a number of other business groups. He said, if we offer de minimis incentives, it will have no value at all. So we're hopeful that the EEOC will revisit this concept and maybe change their thinking on the wellness program incentives. Here are some logos of companies that have publicly announced that they're going to offer incentives. This has been cash, gift cards, paid time off after you get the vaccination. And actually, a number of healthcare workers received Super Bowl tickets and an all-expense paid trip to the game last week, which was very exciting for some of them. These are mostly public-facing organizations, but a few manufacturers and a few public agencies. And here in Houston, one of the very big medical centers has offered a $500 incentive to their employees to get vaccinated. So this is the question that we get a lot. Can we mandate the vaccine for our employees? Yes, but just because you can, should you? There's some risk here because the current vaccines are only authorized by the FDA as emergency use. That may change in the coming months, but this is really, we think, a risk that you should consider. Generally speaking, it's common for healthcare workers to be required to get vaccinations as a condition of their employment, but that's because for their safety, their own safety, and the safety of the public. I've seen 3 or 4 surveys in the last month where corporate executives have said they're considering mandating a vaccine, but very few have made a public announcement. You should also note that some legislatures are considering state legislation to either encourage or prevent employers from mandating vaccinations. We're watching this carefully. And in many sectors, the unions object to vaccine mandates, but they are working really hard to encourage their union members to participate in vaccination programs. Now we're going to talk about the practical implications of having a vaccination program.
Thanks, Fern. All right, so once you decide which kind of program you're going to roll out, whether it's to encourage or incentivize or to mandate, there are some legal considerations you want to think through as your employees respond to that. And the first thing you want to think about having is a written policy for vaccines. If you don't already have an inoculation policy in your handbook or a set-aside policy, really now is the time to do it. It helps to, openly be transparent and communicate with your staff and your employees about what you want to do with the vaccine. So whether you decide to mandate or incentivize, have a policy that sets out what the company is doing. making clear that it really only applies to employees. It doesn't apply necessarily to guests or customers or visitors to the workplace. If you're going to encourage the employee to receive the vaccine, say that. Be clear from leadership. Talk about that you believe that the vaccine is safe. The federal government believes the vaccine is safe, and use some of the education materials and talking points that Fern referenced before in terms of why you as a company want to encourage all of your employees to receive the vaccine. Of course, because if you're going to have employees receive the vaccine, or if you're going to mandate it, you certainly have to have an avenue to request an accommodation for either medical or religious exemptions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that policy should clearly lay out that there is an avenue to request an accommodation, even if you're going to incentivize somebody. If you're going to incentivize somebody with a $500 gift card, that could be substantial to somebody. And if somebody is unable to receive that gift card because of a medical issue, they need to be able to request an accommodation through a particular written avenue. If you're going to mandate it and or encourage it, and you want employees to show that they have been vaccinated, you can have them provide written evidence of immunization through a healthcare provider or pharmacy. That information, as I'll say later, is confidential. So you want to just make sure that that is kept in HR and kept separate and apart in a separate medical file. To the extent that you are a larger company, are able to provide assistance with on-site access, that's a good thing to discuss in the policy, or identify sites in your county where they can go and receive the vaccine. Maybe consider, providing help to individuals to sign up to receive the vaccine. Some local counties are requiring access to an email account or the internet access, smartphone, a phone number. So you may want HR to help administer for if you have certain population of your workforce who might not have access to those things, to be able to help them sign up for the vaccine. Then you'll want to talk through whether your company will pay for the costs associated with the vaccine. As Fern mentioned, President Biden's in his executive order, encourages employers to make it at no cost. But there may be some costs associated, if you go to the pharmacy, there may be an administration fee. The vaccine itself, my understanding is that it is free, it is no cost, but there may be, again, some attendant associated costs. And then would you provide paid time off, to encourage employees to go get the vaccine or the second shot in and above and beyond their already paid time off. And then of course you want to make sure any policy that you're talking about with this vaccine, that there's no retaliation for anyone who requests an accommodation, or somehow decides not to get a vaccine, or otherwise seeks assistance under the policy. As I said, you can ask your employees to provide documentation from a healthcare provider or pharmacy showing the date the vaccine was administered. Obviously, particularly if you're going to mandate it, you're going to make sure that you want to have people show documentation. That would be true of employees. That would be true of applicants if you want to make that a condition of employment. A pre-hire medical test, they can show that through documentation. But because that information is medical record under the Americans with Disabilities Act, it has to be kept separately from the personnel file. And it should not be widely distributed or discussed. So you really cannot disclose a particular employee's vaccination status to coworkers. So if someone comes, we get these questions a couple of times, someone doesn't want to report to work unless they know that all the other coworkers that they're going to be working with in their area are also vaccinated. That is not a permissible, disclosure. You cannot tell that coworker whether coworker A or B has or has not been vaccinated. Similarly, you can't, if someone says, well, I want to come to work, but I only want my other coworkers to be vaccinated as well, or vice versa, I refuse to be vaccinated. That information is not to be shared among coworkers or generally disclosed within the workplace. Some questions we ask, if your company offers the vaccine on a voluntary basis and uses a voluntary pre-screening questionnaire to assess the ability to receive it, what can you do if the employee refuses to complete the questionnaire? And here, same thing, because it's voluntary, you can decline to administer the vaccine if someone refuses to respond to a pre-screen questionnaire, if you're offering it on an on-site basis or otherwise. But as I mentioned previously, retaliation and intimidation is prohibited. Again, because the vaccine is voluntary, changes to your position because someone has not received the vaccine would be deemed retaliatory. So just think through that if you're going to consider offering it on a voluntary basis. But if you require the vaccine and the employer refuses the vaccination because of a disability, what can you do? You can, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, exclude the employee from the workplace if he or she poses a direct threat to the health of others, which can't be eliminated or reduced by a reasonable accommodation. And the EEOC has said that COVID-19 is a direct threat, which is why we're in a situation that you can require testing in the workplace, you can require the vaccination, so long as you look at whether someone needs an accommodation. So while there is a high bar and there's an individualized assessment, we are still in that stage where it's considered a direct threat standard. So you want to think about what accommodations you can provide to that worker based on the nature of your workforce and the employee's position. So is this a situation where that employee can continue to telework until their situation changes and they can be vaccinated? Or is this a situation where you can restructure their job? There's no specific requirement that you must restructure, but is there a possibility there might be other positions that this person is qualified for where vaccination is not required? If all of those questions go through and you do the analysis and the individualized assessment and you realize this person cannot perform his or her essential functions of their job without getting a vaccination because it's mandated and because of their specific job duties, you are able to go through that analysis of excluding them from the workforce through either a leave of absence or some other accommodation. And a similar thing with religious practices and belief. If you require the vaccination and your employee refuses to be vaccinated because of a sincerely held religious belief or practice, you need to do the same analysis as I just discussed with an employee with a disability. You need to go through that interactive process, that individualized assessment, because you have to provide a reasonable accommodation unless it's going to pose an undue hardship under Title VII. Religious accommodations are analyzed under Title VII, whereas disability accommodations are handled under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the EEOC has explained that undue hardship is more than a de minimis cost or burden on the employer. And my general advice and counsel to employers when it comes to requests for religious accommodations is that you likely need to grant it. I mean, almost always, because according to the EEOC, employers should ordinarily assume that a request for accommodation is based on this sincerely held religious belief, unless you have objective basis to question the sincerity of the religious or religion stated. We're hearing that there are lots of organizations that are affiliated with various religions that are, providing cards for, a cost to workers that they can say, I am a member of this religion and my pastor has stated that it is, I should not take the vaccine, based on my religious beliefs. I think this is going to be a huge landmine for employers. I think it's going to be much more easier for someone to arguably claim that they have a religious exemption than they do potentially a medical exemption. So another reason why you want to think about, if you mandate the vaccine, are you opening a door to these types of HR landmines where your HR team is going to be inundated potentially with a lot of refusals or requests for accommodations because of either a disability or because of a religious practice or belief. So something to take into account when you're evaluating which type of vaccine program you want to roll out at work. If you do get an accommodation request, this is a really good time for you in your company to start to train your managers and retrain your managers on how to recognize a request for an accommodation. In my practice in employment counseling for the last dozen years, providing accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act has created a lot of confusion for employers, as every request is different and every request needs an individualized assessment. And so I've seen HR get tripped up a lot in how to manage this. And so I'd really encourage all employers to take the time now in advance of rolling out a vaccine program to train your managers to how to receive that request and how to process it. You want to have standard forms for workers who need to make a request that they can complete, and provide supporting documentation of a request for either a medical or religious exemption. Once you have that standard form and it's been returned to you, then HR needs to start their process of the individualized assessment to determine whether the direct threat exists from a worker who refuses to be vaccinated. And these are, these 4 factors, right? The duration of the risk could be a long time. We don't know how long, COVID is going to be around, but it could be a long time until there is at least herd immunity in the United States. The nature and severity of the potential harm, we think that's still very high, given the implications of COVID and the harm and deaths that have occurred. The likelihood the potential harm will occur and the imminence of the potential harm. So as I said, these are individualized assessments based on the individual's worker. They could be in a job duty where these factors are not as high as maybe some other employees who may be more public facing or in a different industry. You want to have that flexible interactive process to talk through with the worker what options there are that don't constitute an undue hardship to the employer. You as the employer get to choose the accommodation. The employee doesn't get to choose the accommodation, but you do have a duty to engage with them in this interactive process, which should be well documented so that you can defend any accommodation that is decided upon. And you certainly want to document a situation where there is an undue hardship, where you may need to exclude someone from the workplace, put them out on a leave of absence, or somehow separate their employment. So documenting this entire process is very important. And then reminding your managers and supervisors that they can't disclose who's receiving a reasonable accommodation or why, and certainly can't retaliate against an employee for requesting accommodation. And if you get to that final step where you're thinking about maybe this is a situation where we may need to terminate an employee for refusing the vaccine, I think this is a situation where you definitely want to seek legal advice before executing that decision, just given the changes in the regulations, the changes in liability decisions, and any attendant risks that may be out there. So if you can't provide a reasonable accommodation to an employee who refuses because of disability or religion, can I terminate? And I think I just talked about that. You can't exclude them from the workplace. It doesn't necessarily mean you can automatically terminate them, because there may be some other accommodations that would not create an undue hardship, such as working from home, such as taking an unpaid leave of absence or an extended leave of absence, or under your own policies. So again, this is why I really counsel you on seeking legal advice before executing that final decision of terminating an employee if they refuse a vaccine due to either a disability or religion. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Lindsay, to talk about different issues that happen after the vaccination.
Thanks, Kara. So you have employees who have been vaccinated, now what? And the main points that we're going to focus on today is first, this issue of OSHA record keeping related to vaccinations, and then how do you treat this employee in the work environment now that they have received the vaccine? So first, as to the issue of OSHA record keeping, we've already received this question. We know it's a question on a lot of employers' minds at this point, is what to do if an employee has a reaction to the vaccine. And it's going to be different depending on the type of program that you have in place, whether the vaccination is mandatory or whether it is voluntary. So this slide here addresses the issue of if the company requires a vaccination and the employee has an adverse or allergic reaction to the vaccine, required by the employer, is this going to be a recordable case on the OSHA 300 log? And the answer right now is likely yes, if the reaction meets one of the general recording criteria. And those general recording criteria, again, are going to be medical treatment beyond first aid, days away from work. I think those two are probably the most likely results from an adverse reaction to vaccination, but then also, work restriction or death. If the employer does mandate the vaccination, under OSHA's guidance, it is likely then to be considered a condition of employment. And if it's considered a condition of employment, then it's going to be considered work-related under the record-keeping standard assessment. But again, if the employee's reaction to the vaccine is pretty mild, if they were just to develop a rash around the injection site that does not actually require any medical treatment, maybe it's just sort of a little uncomfortable or itchy, that sort of reaction would not be recordable because it doesn't result in one of the outcomes that is required for a recordable case. But if, that rash required some medical treatments and medical ointments, prescription level ointment or something like that, or if the employee got really sick and required some days away from work, if the vaccination has been mandated by the employer, then likely it will be a recordable case. So what if the program is voluntary? What if the vaccination is voluntary? The company maybe provides the vaccine on site on a voluntary basis, and the employee has a reaction. Would this instance be recordable? And this is pretty unclear at this point. So I think the answer right now is maybe. Under OSHA's current guidance related to reactions to vaccines, it will be dependent on whether the vaccine is provided specifically to protect the employee against exposures that they would experience in the work environment. OSHA has not yet issued guidance on this particular issue of record keeping. It has indicated that such guidance is forthcoming. They should be putting out guidance at some point to address this particular issue, but they haven't yet. So what we look to now when analyzing this question is the current guidance that they have. And there is an OSHA FAQ out there that relates to vaccines for smallpox. And if an employee receives a vaccine for smallpox and they have a reaction, OSHA has said that that reaction would be recordable if it's necessary to perform the employee's job duties. So even if it's not a mandated vaccine, but it would be necessary for that employee's particular job duties, then it could still be a recordable case. Now, obviously, COVID is very different than smallpox. Smallpox is something that, you're really only likely to see in the work environment and likely a healthcare worker, or maybe, an employee who has to travel for their job. COVID is obviously, there's a lot more proliferation of COVID, both inside and outside the work environment. So to be able to draw that line, like OSHA did for that particular smallpox vaccine example, is not as clear here. And obviously the vaccine could be necessary from both a work perspective as well as just for the employee's health outside the work environment. So this question is definitely a little unclear at this point. Hopefully there will be more specific guidance on this, but that is the general evaluation that OSHA has required in the past for vaccine reactions. So in addition to this OSHA record keeping issue, something that has come up as a question that we've received and something that we've definitely been looking into is, okay, you have employees who have been vaccinated. Now, how should they be treated in the work environment? Can they be treated differently in the work environment than those employees who haven't been vaccinated, as far as, having to have the social distancing and wear masks and safeguards like that employers have put in place already to address the issue of COVID-19 exposures. And so far, the guidance has been, yes, a vaccinated person still has to undergo all of these same safeguards as a non-vaccinated person. This slide specifically addresses the guidance that OSHA put out very recently, I believe just last week, about COVID-19 in the work environment. And in that guidance, OSHA expressly said that it is important for employees to continue to wear those face coverings and remain physically distant from their coworkers, even if they have been vaccinated, because there's just not enough information at this point to determine how that vaccination will impact the ability to transmit the COVID-19 to other employees and coworkers. And then Cal OSHA has said the same thing in its emergency standard. Cal OSHA, or the FAQs associated with the emergency standard, Cal OSHA specifically addressed this question as well. And it said, for now, at least, that all prevention measures have to continue even for those employees that have been vaccinated. So this will definitely be an evolving issue as more information comes out related to the transmissibility of COVID-19 after an individual has been vaccinated. That will impact this guidance going forward. But for now, both OSHA and Cal OSHA have said that all of the same safeguards apply to those employees who have been vaccinated as those who have not been vaccinated. And this aligns with guidance that we actually got from the director of NIOSH back in November. Dr. John Howard, was asked, what happens when we have a vaccinated worker? Can a vaccinated worker still be transmissible? And he said at this point, again, there's just not enough information out there about the transmissibility of COVID-19 to make a determination that a person who gets the vaccine wouldn't be able to transmit it to someone else. So because of that, because we don't have that study, we don't have that data in the workplace that does have a collection of people who have been vaccinated, there still needs to be implementation of those safeguards and those mitigation measures that employers are already doing to protect their employees from potential exposures. And then most recently, the CDC actually put out guidance just yesterday about how vaccinated persons should be treated generally and in the work environment. And they said that they mirrored what OSHA has said, what Cal OSHA has said. Basically, you want to continue to have those safeguards in place, require your vaccinated employees to continue wearing masks, practicing social distancing, following all established guidelines at this point. Significantly, however, the CDC did say, related to quarantine, that a person who has been vaccinated, who has been exposed to someone with suspected or confirmed COVID, does not need to quarantine if it meets all three elements that were outlined in the CDC guidance. So the first is that the individual has been fully vaccinated, and what the CDC is interpreting that to mean is it has been at least 2 weeks following the receipt of a second dose if it's a 2-dose vaccine, or the 1 dose if it's a single dose vaccine. The second is that they have received the vaccine within 3 months of the exposure. And then the third is that this individual has remained asymptomatic since the exposure at issue. So a vaccinated person does not need to quarantine per the CDC guidance if it meets all three of these elements. And this is from the CDC, so these are recommendations. Every state is going to be different probably in how it decides to rely on this guidance or whether it decides to rely on this guidance. So it's still important for employers to be aware of what the state is specifically requiring as to vaccinated individuals. But this is the guidance that the CDC has put out. The CDC also noted that if the vaccinated person does not meet all three of these criteria, maybe they were exposed to someone 5 or 6 months after they have actually received the last dose in the series of the vaccination, then again, they should continue to follow the same quarantine guidelines that would apply for an unvaccinated person. And then finally here, we just highlight some of the liability risks with not only the vaccines, but just COVID-19 generally, and how employers are choosing to deal with COVID-19 and implement safeguards in the work environment. So this just kind of goes through some of the liability that employers could face. We've seen recently some potential for shareholder lawsuits. There, I think, was one recently filed against a company for allegedly misleading shareholders about COVID-19 and how prolific it was in the work environment. So that is a potential liability that employers could face related to COVID-19 generally. Workers' compensation claims, I'm sure at this point, a lot of you are familiar with the types of issues that can arise with workers' compensation claims related to COVID-19. But, you know, similar to the OSHA record keeping issue, as these vaccines are administered, if they are being administered at work or they are being administered at work pursuant to a mandate that the vaccine be taken from the employer, then if there is an adverse reaction to the vaccine, how could that impact workers' comp, and could that increase workers' comp claims? There is a mandate that OSHA, from President Biden, that OSHA by March 15th put out an emergency standard if they choose to do so. So an executive order informed OSHA, you know, you get to decide whether there is an emergency standard, but you have to make that decision and put out the standard by March 15th. So there could definitely be additional implications for employers if OSHA decides to issue an emergency standard by March 15th, both, again, from the perspective of just how they address COVID-19 in the workplace, as well as, you know, whether there is any regulation or requirement related to vaccines and the treatment of vaccinated workers. And then finally here, OSHA enforcement priorities. COVID has definitely become an enforcement priority for OSHA. We've seen a lot of enforcement actions, particularly I think over the last, 6-7 months, where OSHA is going into the workplace and determining whether employers have implemented sufficient safeguards to protect those employees who are in the work environment. And I think, we will continue to see those. We'll probably see enforcement an even greater priority with the change in administration. So that is something also to keep an eye on and be aware of. And, as again, vaccine programs are implemented, and you now have vaccinated workers in the work environment, OSHA will likely also be assessing how those workers are being treated pursuant to the guidance that it just issued recently. Like I said, I believe last week. So with that, I think we have some time for some questions. And I think we've already received some questions so far. Before we hop into that, this slide shows we do have a lot of resources out there on COVID-19, and we are generating resources on the vaccine and implementation of the vaccine. So definitely, if you are looking for some resources on COVID-19, check out our task force site. There's a bunch of stuff there available for you. And then we also have blogs, both the OSHA Defense Report and the Employer Defense Report, that we keep up to date as new information comes out, as information changes and guidance changes. These are a really good resource for you all to keep up on those changes and any new guidance.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks Fern and Lindsay. I hope everyone found the presentation useful and practical, and you've got some good resources to bring back to your workplaces. We do have some time for some questions. But let's see if we can tackle some of these questions. We are getting a lot of them, so apologize in advance if we don't touch on your question. We certainly will follow up with you afterwards to be able to try and answer your question. So let's see. Lindsay, here's one that maybe you might be able to answer. Is a quarantine day out of work reportable on the OSHA 300 log?
I think that will depend. If the employee is normally in the work environment and they have to quarantine out of the work environment because, potentially they were exposed to someone who has COVID-19, then that could be a recordable case. Where we've distinguished the quarantine issue is for employees who regularly work from home. If employees can regularly work from home and do regularly work from home, and they have to quarantine because of a potential exposure, for example, then we have generally advised our clients that that would likely not be considered days away from work, as long as that individual is already working from home and regularly does work from home. But if the individual is in the work environment and has to quarantine because they have COVID-19, they have been diagnosed with COVID-19, then that would be a recordable days away from work situation.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from somebody who is a contractor who performs a lot of work in hospitals and nursing homes and medical office buildings. And, each year the client wants proof that the employees have had a flu shot in order to perform work. Same thing, what happens if the client is mandating that the team members provide proof of a vaccine to work in their facility? What should you do? Yes, you should find team members that have been vaccinated to perform the work. That is, as we said, employers can mandate vaccines and people coming in to work in their work site to have vaccines. So that would be something you'd want to certainly encourage and educate your team members to get vaccinated as soon as they could, and to, once vaccinated, provide proof in order for you to be able to staff them at your contracted sites. That's true also if you are, in one of those categories where you are an essential worker, whether it's, part of the food distribution, agriculture, again, providing work, contract work, temp work, staffing work in medical facilities. You can provide a letter to your employees that they can bring to the pharmacy or to the mass vaccination site or to whatever vaccination site they're able to get an appointment, explaining that they are an employee of your company and that you are deemed essential worker in that category, however that is defined in your state or in your county. That's a good recommendation so that employees have something armed with them to take with them to demonstrate that they are eligible to be vaccinated in accordance with the county guidelines.
And Kara, could I just clarify something with my prior response? Because I do want to make sure that this is clear. If you have a case of COVID-19, you are going through the same record keeping analysis that you would for any other injury or illness. So work relatedness is also something that needs to be considered. So I was speaking from the perspective of, the COVID-19 case is work related, but that is something that needs to be analyzed. That is not automatic. I think we've talked about this in other presentations, but, with the proliferation of COVID-19, it is important to analyze that work-related component. And if you determine that the COVID-19 case is not work-related, then it's not recordable. So I just wanted to clarify that to make sure that people do know that it's still important to go through that work-related analysis.
Thanks, Lindsay. Someone asked a question whether we'd recommend conducting a survey to solicit information from staff to see if they're planning on getting vaccinated. That certainly can be part of your, education and encouraging part of a rollout program. Obviously, anything that you get returned back needs to be kept confidential and not disclosed with others. And that would probably be something to make sure that the staff understood that the responses are being kept confidential, given that whether they choose to be vaccinated, could be a private issue. So I apologize, we've got probably time for one more. Here's one from a school that mandate teachers vaccine that do not have a medical or religious exemption. Yep, I think that's true. I could see where schools absolutely would require a vaccination for their teachers as educators. That would be an industry that could likely require a vaccine. As Fern mentioned, there may be some issues if you've got a teachers union, and that's a bargainable issue with your labor union. So you'd certainly want to talk with a labor union. Otherwise, if it's a private non-union school, I don't see any problem as long as you make accommodations for a medical or religious exemption. It looks like we're just coming up at 2 o'clock, so I apologize if we were unable to get to everybody's questions, but we will follow up and answer any questions that may still be outstanding. And of course, if you think of other questions after today's presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out to either myself or to Fern or to Lindsay, and we'd be happy to make ourselves available. Thank you again for attending today's webinar, and we appreciate your time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.